Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Conor McNally. I'm the Communications Manager at Energy Futures Lab, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this week's lunchtime webinar. This week, we're joined by Andrea Gaon-Lombardo, who is a PhD candidate in the Electrochemical Science and Engineering Research Group here at Imperial College. Andrea has a degree in Chemical Engineering from the National Autonomous University of Mexico and a Master's in Advanced Chemical Engineering from the University of Cambridge. Previously, Andrea worked as an engineer at Grupo SSC in Mexico and at the Schlumberger Gould Research Centre in Cambridge, where she was involved in research on electrochemical devices for energy storage. Her current research focuses on the implementation of machine learning algorithms in the design and optimization of electrodes for electrochemical energy storage technologies, and that's what she's going to speak to us about today. Before that, just a quick word about how the webinar will work. Andrea is going to speak for around about 30 minutes and then she'll take your questions. To submit a question, use the Q&A box that's on the right hand side of your screen, and please do put your name and affiliation with your questions just to identify yourself as you would if we were meeting in person. With that, I'll hand over now to Andrea.
Okay. Hello, Connor. Thank you very much for organizing this, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us, and well, hope you find the talk interesting. Well, as Connor explained, I'm Andrea Gaon-Lombardo. I'm a third-year PhD student. I'm working under the supervision of Professor Nigel Brandon and Dr. Samuel Cooper. So basically, I'm going to talk to you about recent work that we've published and on the design and optimization of electrode microstructure using machine learning. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction about why electrode microstructure is very important. So as you can see from this image, which is a very interesting image from paper UCL, well, you can see that from a battery, if you zoom in, one of the main components is the electrode. So the electrode is constituted as as a porous material, and this is really important because basically, if you see from one of the models that some authors have presented, the electrode is a complex porous media. So as you can see, simulating or making predictions of the transfer properties in porous medias are quite complicated. Then you have a transport of species at the electrolyte level, which sometimes is solid state, sometimes is an electrolyte, a liquid electrolyte. Then you have a reaction at the active surface area, and you also have transport within the solid particles. So as you can see, all of these processes come together within a microstructure. And therefore, you also have some battery degradation to deal with. So this is just an introduction to say why electrode microstructure is so interesting for a research area, and why the optimization of the electrode microstructure is so important to develop the next generation of batteries or energy storage systems. So each electrode depends on the specific energy storage system that you're going to use. The transfer processes will also be dependent on the specific type of the energy storage material, energy storage technology that you're trying to implement. So one of the interesting things about one of the interesting approaches that researchers have used to try to understand the electrode microstructure is a forward approach between what is manufactured, then analyzing the microstructure, most commonly using XCT scanned, and then trying to predict the performance by making complex calculations of transport and reactive processes of the within the microstructure. So as you can see, this process can be analyzed as a forward process. But then one of the interesting things that also some researchers have tried to analyze through different type of methods is trying to perform this process forward and backwards process. So you have a microstructure, then you can calculate the performance, And then we want to see how this microstructure can be optimized, well, geometrically speaking, in order to improve the performance. One of these challenges is that we actually don't obtain, do not have a defined function that can tell us what the microstructure is, or then can actually capture the geometrical properties of the microstructure. So some of these approaches that have been used are, for example, dropped spheres, dropped particles, point network models that can, in a way, try to represent what is happening within the microstructure. And in a way, you can make a theoretical optimization of these particles, but they're not actually like a representation of the reality. So what we want to do, what I just said, is that we would like to obtain this function that we call it the g of theta that captures the essence of the microstructure, and then from that calculate certain performance. With this performance, we can go back and optimize the microstructure based on a defined set of parameters that that give us the function. So based on what I just said, the objectives of this project is that once we have a microstructure, for example, this is an XT image from a lithium-ion cathode, we can extract a function, and the characteristic of this function says, as I said, is that it can capture the essence of the microstructure. This means that we want, what we mean by the essence is a function that can give us the probability distribution function that defines the microstructure. We want it to be a virtual representation, so we can then get calculate simulations of performance over it. It has to be fully differentiable so that we can then perform an optimization. And we can be able to produce realistic samples from these particular functions that are that actually will represent how the real microstructure is. So in order, aiming to find this function that defines a microstructure, we're going to implement the type of machine learning algorithm that is called generative adversarial networks, or GANs. Having said that, I will tell you a little bit about where GANs come from and how this algorithms work. So in the whole area of artificial intelligence, we have machine learning, and within machine learning there's a subsection that is called deep learning. So one of the recent approaches and advantages of deep learning is the ability to generate what is called deep generative models. So these deep generative models, what they do is that they try to approximate the probability distribution function of a set of training data by learning a model that can basically produce synthetic samples that have the same probability distribution function of the training data. So within these deep generative models, one of the ones we'll be using is generative adversarial networks. Okay, so to tell you how generative adversarial networks work, I will give a brief example that it's a detective criminal game. So imagine that you have a detective that has been trained to actually to detect whether a type of money is fake or if it's real. And then we have a criminal that is really good at making fake samples of the real money. If we put both of them together to play, they will improve each other until the detective will no longer be able to differentiate between the fake and the real money, and the criminal is really good at making synthetic samples of the fake money. So this is basically the principle of GANs. So it's an adversarial game in which we have what is called discriminator, that in this case is our detective, that can take samples of the real training set and from fake samples and tell us whether one sample has been synthetic or whether it has been obtained from the training set. And we have our generator, that is like our criminal. And the generator from latent vector of basically noise, random noise can generate synthetic images that can represent the training set. So if you put both of them together in a Minimax game, well, in a Minimax adversarial game, the discriminator tries to basically differentiate between the real and synthetic samples, and then the generator tries to fool the discriminator by improving, by learning how to create more realistic samples. So the whole training process is a Minimax game that is defined by this equation, in which like I said, the discriminator tries to maximize the probability of assigning the correct labels to the real data or to the data generated by the generator. And the generator's task is to minimize the probability of the discriminator assigning the labels correctly. So this Minimax game is the training process of our GANs until they achieve what is called an Nash equilibrium, in which the discriminator can no longer distinguish between the real and synthetic samples, and the generator can, create images that are as realistic as the real samples. So, for example, the way we implemented this is with using three-dimensional tomographic data. So in this case, we have a Tomo 3D image 2D image of basically obtained from a stacked three-dimensional tomographic data of a solid oxide fuel cell anode. And the way we segmented this for obtaining the training set is that we obtain subsamples from this training set in order to generate, we cropped subsamples of 64 cube pixels in order to generate approximately a data of more than 20,000 samples. Now, one of the interesting things before actually training the data set is that when we're using three-phase data, because generator is making fake samples that look real, what will happen is that anything between, anything in the grayscale that is between 0 and 255 could either be one material or it could be uncertainty in the generator. So in order to improve the training process and to avoid this problem with the the uncertainty, we implemented what is called one-hot encoding technique. So our initial data, that is one channel only, we separated that initial data into 3 channels, and each of these channels is represented by matrices of zeros and ones, and each of these channels basically represents one of the phases. So by that, we can say that we have extended our problem to not only be grayscale or RGB, but actually can be n-phase data, so not just 3-phase data. Basically, once we had implemented this step to the data set, we actually trained our generator and discriminator. So we implemented the GANs in 2 case studies. One is the SOFC anode, and another one is the lithium-ion cathode. As you can see, although both images are 3D and 3-phase data, they are very different type of images, and they are generated experimentally in very different type of methods. But basically, we obtain this data, and we use this data that is available open source, and we use this as our training set. So the training set that we had for the solid oxide fuel cell is more than 45,000, and for the lithium ion approximately 14,000. Once that we had implemented our learning process, that we can obtain some of the samples of the synthetic images. And as you can see, this is a representation of, a comparison of what the real microstructure looks like and what the generated microstructure looks like. So visually, you can see that there is no difference between both generated and synthetic images. And if we see the same for the SOFC anode, we can see again that basically there's no visual difference between either of them. So now we can say that we have a generator that with any random sample can generate any synthetic images of the SOCs or of the lithium-ion cathode. Well, because it's not just enough to see whether this is represented, visually, we calculated some of the morphological, microstructural properties that usually represent, or characterize a microstructure. So for the lithium-ion cathode, as you can see, we calculated the volume fraction, surface area, relative diffusivity, and the three-phase boundary density. And as you can see, the mean of the generated values and the mean of the training set are within, are very basically are the same. And although we can see that the variability of the generated sample is lower than the training set, we can see that we generate unique samples of that represent the training set. By calculating the same morphological properties over the SOC anode, we can see that basically again the means fall within the envelope of the training set. So basically we can see that now not only the images generated are visually the same, but also if you calculate the properties, they are basically virtually the same. So we can say that any instance that we can generate of the lithium-ion or the SOC cathode represents the exact image from the training set. Now we also perform a calculation of what is called a two-point correlation function. So basically what the two-point correlation function does is that if you have 2 pixels, it calculates the probability that both pixels belong to the same phase as a function of the distance that separates them. So basically at the beginning that they're correlated, and as it tells us, as the distance becomes larger, you can see that there's no correlation between the one voxel and the other. So this is a very important metric that is used for analyzing long-range properties of porous materials. So by calculating this, we can see that the synthetic images generated fall within basically the envelope of the real microstructures in terms of all the phases and along all directions. And if we see the same for the SOC anode, we can see that not only it falls within the means, but it also represents the same exponential type of exponential decay that is called the Hall effect. So we basically can see that now we have generated 3-dimensional realizations of the image that pretty much, based on all of these calculated tests or properties, represent the real microstructure. So why is this important for us? Because we can say now that the train generator, which is represented by a lower amount of, it takes less space than the real images of the train images, can generate any sort of instance of the microstructure that we want. And basically, based on these images, we can perform any type of electrochemical simulation or transport simulation, which we can then relate back to our virtual representation of our generator that is parameterized not only by theta but also by the set space. Right, another important property of these generated images is that not only we can generate, the small training set samples, we can also generate images as large as we want. For example, in this case, you can see that we can generate images up to, basically the size that we want. And one interesting thing is that the original tomographic data was only 256 cube pixels. And with the generator, we're able to make images that are, twice the size of the original data. In some cases, because imaging is quite complicated, it's hard to image such large data without reducing the details of the properties. So with this, we have just proved that we can generate images larger than the original training set, which then can be used for analysis or performing electrochemical properties. Another interesting finding of this is that with the train generator, we can manipulate one of the layers, so we can generate periodic structures. So, for example, if we generate what we call circular padding at the between layers 1 and 2 of the train dataset, you can see that we can generate this structure that has continuity along the exactly at the edges. So the important thing about this is that most electrochemical simulations or transport simulations do not really reduce the how realistic the processes are at the edges by cropping, I don't know, one particle in half. And because we realize that this can be reduced by generating periodic simulations. So, for example, if you compare a non-periodic structure with a periodic structure, you can see that there's continuity in the transport properties from one side to the other. And if we see, for example, by calculating the flux density, we can see that in here, and where you see the red arrows, basically what comes out can come back in the next slide. Well, if you have a periodic boundary simulation, you can see that if you put them back together, you can see that at the edges there's flux channels that have been opened. And basically, this is a more realistic representation of what's happening inside of the microstructure. And by doing this, we can actually reduce the size of the representative volume that we need for calculating microstructural properties or for any type of simulation. So once we have obtained already basically what we call our function that fully defines our microstructure, one interesting thing that we are aiming to do for the next steps, and I'm going to show you a glimpse of what we're doing at the moment, is with the generator we want to relate how the set space we can see if the set space that defines also the generator can be optimized in order to obtain different microstructural properties. So the way we do that by linking all these processes from the set space to the calculated property is that we try to build a Gaussian process. So Gaussian process is a surrogate function that can tell us, that can sort of approximate what's happening from the set space to the desired property to optimize. So this is what we're trying to implement now. And then some of the things that we do is that you obtain a set space, you obtain a surrogate model of that function to be optimized. The Gaussian process would then give you a next point, and then you feed that point back into the same Gaussian process, and you update that process until you minimize the objective function or maximize the objective function. Some of the properties that we want to maximize in this case for the purpose of transport properties is, for example, the relative diffusivity along the pore phase. So this is an example of what's happening. So if we start with some values of relative diffusivity that can be pretty low, we can then implement a Gaussian process that can then optimize. Move the set space in order to obtain a higher relative diffusivity. As you can see, I've put here the images of the microstructure. So the idea of doing this is that because the generator is, between that state of, of calculating the properties, then the microstructure is necessarily realistic. So in some cases, when you try to optimize certain properties, then you reduce the how realistic the image is. So in this case, we're not reducing the resolution or how realistic the image is. We're maximizing these kind of properties. This is just the first example of how it works, but as you can see, we can continue maximizing it until we actually get to what an ideally maximum relative diffusivity would be. We can also do that by maximizing the porosity. Well, in this case, both of them are correlated. So we maximize the relative diffusivity, and we see how the porosity of the black phase changes. Well, and this is basically how we have managed to maximize certain properties that are of interest to our to our materials, basically. So some conclusions from this work is that, well, a single generator architecture can be used to represent different microstructures. In this case, we implemented a type of architecture for generating the solid oxide fuel cell anode and the lithium-ion cathode. And we realized that basically this generator architecture is, well, the ideal one for these type of systems. We then can use one train generator to make images as large as we want and as many as we want. The virtual representation is approximately about, in this case, 50 megabytes, which in many cases can be can occupy less space than a real image, which can be up to, well, I don't know, many gigabytes. And by manipulating the generator, we can generate images with periodic boundaries, which can significantly reduce the size of the desired representative elementary volume for any type of simulations. Well, one of the future steps that we want to work on is continuing analyzing how we can optimize the electrode microstructure. So we will try to do something we can see that the electrode can be optimum according to the application. So if we want to, an electrode that has higher specific surface area, we could do that, or if we get an electrode that has higher diffusivity, we could do that. So that is another, the area that we're trying to understand now and implement the Gaussian processes for. What we're interested in doing next is not only performing the performing the mass transfer simulations over the periodic boundaries and not periodic boundaries images, but also try to understand how these boundaries impact the electrochemical simulation. For example, how this can impact the lithiation state, or how this can impact I don't know, basically the performance of the predicted performance of a battery. And then, well, we can generate optimal microstructure to improve the performance. So far we have only optimized based on certain microstructural properties, but it will be interesting for the next step to try to then optimize, but based on a desired performance. And, well, one interesting thing that we haven't really analyzed, but it will be important for future steps, would be if once we have optimized the latent space, which in this case is just a set of parameters that have no physical meaning, how can this be related to the experimental experimental parameters like temperature, or the way that the experimental process of building this electrode is. So this is a challenging step, but that is where hopefully future researchers can focus on. Well, I really want to give special thanks to Dr. Lucas Moser, Dr. Antonio Del Rio, Dr. Stephen Nittling, who have been very helpful and have given us insightful conversations of all of this process. I want to thank Conocidos en Mexico for funding. And, well, this is a recent paper that has been accepted in Nature Computational Materials. So, but the online version is already available. If you want to have a look at it, please do so. And, well, some of the publications that we've made throughout this throughout my PhD. And, well, thank you very much. I'll be really happy to take any of your questions now.
Thank you very much for that, Andrea. And just a reminder that you can submit your questions. The audience can submit their questions using the Q&A box on the right-hand side of the screen. And we've just got a couple in there already.
Sorry. Okay, so I have one from Elton. Would the Gaussian process be able to perform multi-objective optimization? The answer is yes. Right now, I'm just trying to make the first test of optimizing, let's say, only maximum surface area or maximum porosity. But we can basically implement multi-objective function. For example, you can always see that there is a trade-off between the porosity and the specific surface area. So you increase one, you reduce the other, but you want to have an optimum of both. So basically, if our next step actually will be to try to maximize one while maximizing the other until you actually get to a point where you have an optimum. So for that we will require multi-objective optimization, which yes, we can do next. Hope this answers the question. Another one. So the way both of the properties the question is from Isaac. He was wondering if the properties of the generator and the real samples, how were they calculated or measured? They were both measured using the open source software called Tau Factor. So in order to be consistent in the way that we calculate the properties, we calculate them both using this software that is based on images. So the real images were not measured from experiments. Basically because, like I said, this is data we had open source, so it's not something that we developed ourselves or were in our lab. But also, I suppose in terms of the consistency, it's always good to compare, something that you measured, something that you calculated with one technique to the other you calculated with the same technique. So both of them were done using Tau Factor. There is one question from Felipe. So, sorry, it's quite a long question. So this question has basically two questions. One is the lower variability of some microstructure properties from the artificially created samples a problem. It could be a problem because it's actually a problem that we've tried to we're trying to look into because it's a common problem of GANs, the training of DC GANs, the lower variability of samples or the lower variability of images. So that is a problem that has to do with mode collapse, or with basically what's called mode collapse in GANs. In which the objective function is multimodal, and you actually are only focusing on not representing the whole, all of the probability distribution function. So there have been different types of GANs improvements that have tried to cope with that. One of these is the development of other types of GANs called WGANs. So in the group we have tried to implement WGANs, but there is a problem with the resolution of the images. So I suppose that there has to be like a trade-off between variability or resolution in this case. So we thought it would be a problem for the optimization process, but actually, as we can see, there's so far no problem in the optimization process. So maybe we'll just keep to the ones with high resolution we already have and overlook the variability problem. So the second question, how long did the training process took? So it's quite computationally intensive. So we required, I think, a Tesla GPU for the training process, and the training process took about 48 hours in the GPU. So the training process of GANs, especially because they're 3D, is quite expensive. But then the advantage is once you have the train generator, generating one of the images can take up to 1 or 2 seconds. So yeah, so that once the training process is done, you can manipulate your generated images as much as you want. So another question on the Gaussian process optimization, based on the results, how you can control the cooking. You measure when your conclusion, but do you have any proposal on how to do that? Sorry, I don't understand that question. How do you control the cooking? Sorry, I'm going to skip that question because I don't really understand it. Thinking about the essence probability functions, are these how the model takes the noise and builds the structure? Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the noise originally is there just to give variability to the samples. So to avoid just, generating the same image all over again. But the essence is captured by the, by the loss function. So the reason how, the reason how like the generative networks work is, well, the approximation of one distribution function versus the generated distribution function is actually what is called, a process of minimizing the difference between two probability functions. That is called the, the Jensen-Shannon divergence function. So basically, what it does is that it tries to, you have a probability function and you try to mimic the other one. So even though you don't have the real probability function or the explicit probability function, you actually have a way of mimicking that probability function by because you have instances of that function. So that is the way it captures the essence. So basically, the set has nothing to do with the essence. The essence is the theta is learned by the theta parameters, and it's just learned through this process. I hope that was clear. Would the method be applicable to other imaging methods, for example, EDX, when mapping the elements in the electrode? I'm sorry, not very familiar with EDX, but as far as I know, these images, the SOFC was not obtained from XCT tomography. It's actually an image obtained from SEM techniques, and the lithium ion was obtained with XCT tomography, and actually the binder phase is not from imaging technique. The way the authors made it is they calculated it and then put it on top of the XCT image. So so based on that, since both of the images were obtained from different imaging methods, I assume that it will be useful for, you will be able to implement that with different type of imaging methods. So the thing with GANs is that it doesn't understand whether it is an anode or a cathode or what it is. It just sees images. So as long as the images are, each of the tiny images are in a way representative of the total large image, and as long as it's just an image of pixels, I think GANs can work pretty well on any type of imaging technique. There is an anonymous question. May I ask if there is a mathematical expression of this kind of structural changes in different stages of the battery? Sorry, I sort of don't understand. So mathematical expression of the generator, I suppose that's what they're asking for. Well, not really. I assume so. The generator is parameterized by theta, which is about, I don't know how many thousands of basically parameters. So I don't think there's an analytical function that could describe what G means. That's why we used one of these convolutional neural networks, in which you have a set of parameters, but you don't actually know the analytical function that defines the correlation between those parameters and the output, basically. So I don't think there's a mathematical expression to say what G represents. There is another one from Mark. If I understood well, the training ons for each two chemistries you have. So Mark is asking if we can train only one GAN, but where the latent vector set as input of the generator G takes into account two properties of each chemistry. So I assume you're asking if you can use one generator to make images of different type of microstructures. I suppose so. Sorry, I mean, I haven't tried doing this. So, but as far as I know, the original GANs were trained in images of, for example, not only cats, but cats and horses and dogs, and it can represent, basically any type of those animals. So let's say that we train it in the world of, different electrode microstructures, and you actually have a combination of, instead of the set space, but a combination of the training set of the two different microstructures. Probably you can be able to create both microstructures, but the problem is what happens in between. So for example, if we use the same, if you combine the training sets, in this case of the SOFCs and the lithium ion, potentially you can have like synthetic realizations of both of them, and you will have a very large generator that can understand both of both of those microstructures. But the problem would be what would happen, in between. Maybe you will have an image in it that would be like a transition from a lithium ion cathode to SOFC anode, which actually have no physical meaning. So probably it would be an interesting approach to make, but the problem is, like, would it be actually realistic or to have this kind of microstructures, or would it not be? So for example, let's say that you have different microstructures of only the lithium ion, but let's say with different porosities, or in one that has binder and the other one that doesn't have binder. Potentially you can use both microstructures to as a training set, and you will be able to generate instances of all of the all of these two different not chemistries, but two different microstructures, and what happens in between. So an interpolation in the set space between both of them would give you one actually, a new microstructure but of the same lithium ion, but that will be realistic. Okay, so an update from Mark, what takes into account the properties of the chemistry. So you mean what you mean is apart from the image, to also put as an input the chemistry? Probably. I mean, there are some types of GANs that are called conditional GANs that not only uses an input the microstructure, but also they use as an input some certain property. And you can see quite interesting results in which the set space can give you, a predicted property pretty accurately. So I suppose if you also include the type of chemistries, you could get, the real microstructure and the chemistry. But I haven't attempted doing that. So all of these are great, propositions for new, for as next steps processes, I suppose, but something that I haven't really looked into. I suppose there are no further questions. So, well, I hope the questions were clear. Were answered clearly. And well, I think I didn't give my email at the end, but I suppose you can find me at the Imperial College website, and I'll be happy to talk to you, or, drop an email if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was really great. And we had some really good questions there. So thank you to everybody who joined us today and submitted questions. The full webinar will be available on YouTube a little bit later, and you can find our previous webinars on our YouTube channel as well if you missed any of those. Next week, we'll be joined by Dr. Alistair Hales from the Department of Mechanical Engineering, and he'll be speaking about thermal management design optimization for lithium-ion cells and battery packs. So another battery-related talk next week, and I hope you'll join us for that. You can find all the details on the website. But until then, thank you again for joining us this week, and have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.